Now let's take a few minutes and talk about the microscopic anatomy of both compact bone and spongy bone. Compact bone is actually produced in cylinders of material, elongated cylinders of material similar to the cardboard tube that you would find in the center of a roll of paper towel. Now, these cylindrical structures are called osteons. The older terminology for these was Haversian systems, but in my experience, the term osteon has replaced that in most source material. So it's the osteon that is considered the subunit of compact bone. And when you look at compact bone, there's several or many osteons all joined together. The osteons are oriented parallel to the shaft of a long bone. So they're parallel to the diaphysis of the long bone. And each of these osteons, each of these cylinders, is made out of concentric circles of bone. We'll take a look at these in just a minute, but there's some terminology that we need to know in relation to these osteons. In the center of an osteon is what's called the central canal. The older term was Haversian canal. It's this central canal in an osteon that carries the blood vessels and the nerves in that area of the bone. Now, around the central canal, there'll be rings of bone, and those are referred to as concentric lamellae. That word lamella just means layer. So concentric layers of bone around the central canal. Each of the lamella or lamellae in an osteon contains collagen fibers that are all oriented in one direction. And then the next lamella, the next layer, will have collagen fibers that are oriented at 90 degrees. In that way, the collagen fibers end up sort of crisscrossed from lamella to lamella to lamella, and that increases the strength of the bone. Remember, we can compare the collagen fibers to the rebar in reinforced concrete, and because these collagen fibers are at perpendicular angles to each other, from lamella to lamella to lamella, you end up with an increased strength in the bone. Osteocytes, those cells that maintain the bone matrix, will be found in little spaces that exist between the different lamellae. And remember, their job is to maintain the matrix. On this slide, you're looking at a drawing of a wedge of compact bone on the left-hand side, and you're looking at an actual microscopic image on the right. So if we start over here on the left, and I know all of these labels are very hard to read, but what you're looking at here is what's represented up here in the drawing. We see a long bone here, and basically they've taken a little piece, a little wedge of that long bone, just in the area of cortical bone, and they've enlarged it for us. So this would be the outer surface of the bone. There would be periosteum out here. And then as we come inward, we hit compact bone. If we kept going inward, we would hit spongy bone. And depending on where we were on the length of the long bone, we might even hit medullary cavity in here. Now, when you look at the compact bone, you can see these circular structures. These circular structures are the osteons. The black line here is surrounding one osteon in cross section. Here's another one. Here's another one. So these osteons, they are the subunit of cortical bone. They're all combined together to create the cortical or the compact bone. Now remember, we're looking at this in a cross section. These osteons are actually long tubes, and they would travel up and down the length of the long bone. They would be parallel to the shaft of the long bone. We're looking at them in cross section here. Notice that there are rings, concentric rings of bone inside the osteon, and in the very center there's a hollow canal that carries the blood vessels and the nerves. They're showing us the cut ends of the blue veins and the red arteries and the yellow colored nerves. So each of these osteons is composed of concentric rings, and in between the rings, in the space, the very little amount of space in between the rings, you can just see these little dark patches. Those represent the osteocytes that are sort of stuck in between the rings of bone. Over here on the right-hand side, this is an actual image taken from cortical bone, again in cross-section. You could see a nice big osteon right here. All the little dots that you see inside the rings in this osteon, those are osteocytes. And right here in the center, this is the central canal. Now, the osteocytes that are sitting in between the individual lamella, they're actually sitting in a space, a little, again, lacuna. And remember, the plural of lacuna is lacunae. So the little spaces that house the osteocytes within the osteons are called lacunae. Now, each cell in each lacuna is connected to other cells in other lacuna with little tunnels called canaliculi. Now, the canaliculi are really important because if you remember, the osteocytes, these bone cells, make projections. They make little finger projections out of their membrane, and they go through these projections, these fingers of membrane, travel through the canaliculi until they touch the projections of another osteocyte. In this way, the osteocytes can communicate with each other. The little membrane projections that come off of each osteocyte penetrate through the canaliculi until they touch other osteocyte membrane. Remember, the osteocytes can detect mechanical stress, and they need to be able to communicate that information with other cells. Now, in addition to the lacunae that hold the osteocytes and the canaliculi that connect the lacunae to each other, there's also what are called perforating canals inside each osteon. Now, the perforating canals are oriented perpendicular to the central canals. So the central canals travel right down the center of the paper towel tube. The perforating canals are oriented at 90 degrees, perpendicular to the central canal. The perforating canals also contain blood vessels and nerves, so the perforating canals are sort of the entry place and the exit place from the central canal. They're going to connect, in other words, one central canal of one osteon with another central canal of another osteon, so that blood vessels and nerves can travel all through the cortical bone. Now, the lamellae that you find in an osteon also get specific terminology associated with them. we describe circumferential lamellae that are going to extend around the entire circumference of the bone. I'll show you this in just a minute. There are external versions of these, and there are internal versions of these. The external circumferential lamellae are going to lie immediately inside of the periosteum. The internal circumferential lamellae are going to be immediately external to the endosteum. Again, I'm going to show you a picture in a minute. I know it's confusing. Lastly, there are what we call interstitial lamellae. And what these are rings of incomplete osteons. They're just sort of space fillers in between the osteons. If you can imagine it in your mind's eye, if you took 3 or 4 paper towel tubes, cardboard paper towel tubes, and you held them together, there would be some area in and around each tube because the tubes are circular. The interstitial lamellae fill in those extra spaces. So on this slide, we're looking at a drawing of one osteon right here. And again, it's in cross section. Here's a partial osteon right here. And then here's another partial osteon right here. You can see the osteocytes in pink. Remember, those are going to be found in lacunae, little spaces that are found in the area in between the concentric rings of bone. They're showing us the central canal right here, and they're also showing us these little canaliculi, these little tunnels that extend out and connect one lacunae with another, so that the osteocytes can talk to each other. On this slide, we're looking at another wedge of bone. The periosteum is right here. They've peeled it back a little bit for us so we can see it. You can see the blood vessels that are coming into the bone here. These would be the central canals running up and down the length of the bone in the center of an osteon. Each osteon has its own central canal. And then the perforating canals are connecting one central canal with another central canal. The perforating canals are where the blood vessels actually come into the bone and where they exit the bone, and also connecting each of the central canals to another. You can see individual osteons on the cut surface here. Those are going to be pulled together to create the cortical bone. There's going to be some lamellae, some layers that surround all of the osteons. These are those circumferential lamellae. And remember, some of them are going to be close to the periosteum. Some of them are going to be close to the endosteum over on this side. So we're going to give those external and internal names. And finally, there is interstitial lamellae, which fills in the spaces in between the osteons. This little wedge over here shows us individual osteocytes in between the different lamellae, and they're each one sitting in a lacunae. And you can see the individual canaliculi in red that are connecting one lacuna to another. This slide, we can see another wedge of bone drawn out, and we can see another image taken underneath the microscope. So if we start at the outside edge, this is where the periosteum is. And as we come inward, we can see cortical bone here, or compact bone. And we can see spongy bone here, or trabecular bone. Now on the longitudinal surface, we can see a half of an osteon right here, and we can see blood vessels in the central canal. Here's another half osteon. Here's the blood vessels in the central canal. These are perforating canals that are perpendicular to the central canals, and they allow blood vessels to be connected from all of the osteons. Now, if we come in from the periosteum, these are the circumferential lamellae. They are surrounding all of the clustered osteons. The circumferential lamellae are described as being external and internal. The external are the ones that are heading towards the periosteum. The internal are the ones that are heading towards the medullary canal and the endosteum. In the micrograph over here, the image that was taken under the light microscope, we can see a nice osteon right here with concentric layers, concentric lamellae inside. Here's the central canal. Here's another partial osteon right here. And here's another one right here. So from the edge of this osteon to the edge of this one, to the edge of this one, we have this little triangular area right here. This is full of interstitial lamellae. So this is what we would call incomplete osteon material right here. It's actually layered, this little triangle area, but it's not a complete osteon. And finally, we have an image on this slide taken underneath a light microscope. You can see several osteons here. Notice that they're different sizes. There's a partial osteon right here. It would extend outward this way. Here's the central canal. Here are the concentric layers, or the lamellae. Here's another osteon right here. Here's another one right here. Here's another one right here. You can see the central canals. You can see some of those interstitial lamellae in between these osteons. As you travel inward across the osteons, you get to the circumferential lamellae. The outer surface of this compact bone would actually be on this side. The periosteum would be over on this end. And as we come in, we're going to hit inner circumferential lamellae right here. They're close to the endosteum, which is the lining of the medullary cavity. This is where the bone marrow is stored. So again, circumferential lamellae, that is inner because it's around or nearer the endosteum. There would be more circumferential lamellae out here that would be external because it's closer to the periosteum. And the last thing you can see on here is this area right here. This happens to be an area of bone resorption, an active area of bone resorption. So we know there are some osteoclasts in here. There are also going to be osteoblasts in the area that are producing bone. It's just that the osteoclasts right now are more active than the osteoblasts. So there isn't a balance. Instead, there's a net loss of bone in that area.